So for the past couple of weeks, we've really been dealing with issues involving anti-union, anti-labor laws, as well as tort reform, so changes to our judiciary processes. And, I look through these bills, and 5 of these bills that have passed in the last 2 weeks really hurt, I think, the average Missourian. So I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about some of those. I've been sort of keeping a checklist. I've got 5 bills, big corporations, big employers 5, the average Missourian 0. Is where I see us standing right now. But let me go into a few of those bills so that you know exactly what I'm talking about. So Senate Bill 237 has to do with hospitals and their employees. And interestingly, it changes the ability of somebody who has been wronged in a hospital or a nursing home to actually include in a lawsuit that they might have the hospital if the employee is not directly paid by that hospital. So you may have a doctor's group, for example, that works in a hospital. And that doctor's group, they get their paycheck from outside the hospital, from their group and their organization, but they have privileges in the hospital and they are doing surgery in that hospital. And in a case that was talked about on the floor, or another real case that I can think of, but I'll talk about the one that was brought up on the floor where a person had his 2 kidneys. One of the kidneys was functioning at 25%. The other was fully functioning. The one that was functioning at 25% was supposed to be removed, but that was not the one that was removed. The one that was removed was the one that was functioning at 100%. That person didn't die right there on the spot, but in a very short amount of time with only one kidney, which operated at 25%, he lost his life. Under this new legislation that has been passed, if the doctor who operated and made that egregious error by taking out the wrong kidney was not paid for as a hospital employee, but instead paid for by his doctor's group, his surgeon's group, the patient or the patient's family, someone acting on behalf of the patient, would not be able to sue the hospital, only the doctor. So whatever recovery was coming to that family that certainly was never going to make up for the loss of first a kidney and then a life, this family doesn't even have the ability to make themselves whole, whatever that means, by going after the 2 entities involved. So another example I often think of is Regina Turner, who had brain surgery and the wrong side of her brain was operated on, and her life has been forever changed. Now, in that particular case, I don't know the circumstances of whether the doctor was an employee of the hospital or whether the doctor was an employee of an outside group. But should that case happen once this new legislation goes into place, heaven help her to recover what she needs, because it's certainly going to be beyond the $1 million that most of our doctors are required to have as insurance to cover their medical malpractice. And she would not be able to recover more than $1 million if that doctor of hers was employed by an outside doctor's group. And this is true now. This legislation was broadened, so it includes care that you receive in all kinds of places, nursing homes, I'm sure urgent care centers, all kinds of places beyond just the hospitals that it was originally in place, and that even in that case, the hospitals could be sued for some kind of significant damage like this. So that was one of the bills that was passed. We had project labor agreements on the floor, which mean that we've taken away local control, so no political subdivision can engage in hiring a group that would provide project labor agreements, which is agreements through the different entities, the different contractors that need to be involved in building or reforming or fixing whatever kind of project would be going on, whether it's a school district, a municipal building. Nobody can enter into a project labor agreement should this go all the way through the process. And then the one that we've been dealing with most recently, Senate Bill 45, is about arbitration. And currently, some companies, when you start to work for them, have perhaps in their handbook or somewhere it says that should there be a dispute between the employer and the employee will need to enter into arbitration with the employer to settle that dispute. So what that means is an employee who feels that he or she was wronged by their employer, this may be something like sexual harassment, could be sexual assault, could be all kinds of things that you might imagine that could go on in the workplace. We're hopeful they don't, but sometimes they do. There are some bad actors out there. But once the employee sort of accepts that handbook, whether he or she has really read it or not, whether he or she understands what it means or not, by accepting that handbook and going to work and taking that first paycheck, the employee has now entered into an agreement, a contract, if you will, with the employer that says, no matter what, I am going to agree to go to arbitration and not take our case to court. So why is that a problem? Because we're always hopeful that arbitration is fair. But the reality is arbitration companies are hired by corporations over and over again. So an arbitrator who actually decides whether this case should should go to arbitration is also the arbitrator who will hear the case. So it's in, whether conscious or not, it's in the vested interest of the arbitrator to work on behalf of the person who's paying his bills, right? So if that company continues to hire arbitrators and use this firm, they have a vested interest in making sure that complaints will go to arbitration and that they are the arbitrator who will hear those complaints. In arbitration, cases are not public. So let's go back to what we talked about, the idea of sexual harassment in the workplace, or even something as extreme as sexual assault. If you're forced to go to arbitration by your company because you work there and that's a condition of your employment, then that case is swept under the rug. You may be working for a big company and you may not be the only victim of sexual assault, but you may not know of any others because those cases go through arbitration and are settled there and they're not made public. So you may be fearful and you may want to expose the culture of the company through a court procedure and go to a trial with a jury of your peers, but you're not given that option. So what happens is companies that know they have bad behavior going on, even though they may not like it, there is bad behavior going on the part of employers or management, and that keeps getting swept under the rug, which the employer may find that to be in the best interest of their company, but it hides this culture of corruption or bad acting or horrific things happening to an employee, and the employee will have no recourse about making this public. So if you're a young person that is thinking about going to work somewhere and you do all your Google research on that company, you may never find information about what the culture is like there until you get there. And as a new employee, I will say when I was a new employee in companies, particularly as a young employee, I never would have thought to challenge or question anything in that handbook. I'm delighted to get a job, a good job with a good company. I'm delighted to be getting that paycheck and being able to start to take care of myself or maybe pay off my college debt. Or I'm a person who just needs to have a job to make money to put food on the table for myself and my family. And none of us think about, well, down the road, what happens if I am discriminated against, if I am in some way taken advantage of in my situation as somebody who works in that company. So 2 years later, when you get to the point where you have had enough and you've been sexually harassed, again, you end up going to arbitration and don't have the option of going to open court. And for us to undermine the 7th Amendment to our Constitution and say you're not able to access your day in court, and to give corporations and businesses that option to just put into their handbook somewhere something that says we will go to arbitration, I think is opening the door to hiding bad behavior that may exist out there. One of the things I wanted to do was to help protect some of the young people who are just starting out in the work world, specifically from what I keep talking about, which I think is such an egregious action, but a sexual assault or sexual harassment on the job. So I had an amendment that said we will, if you're under 21 years of age, so pretty much starting in a new job, and you have a job, and regardless of whether there is this arbitration portion of your handbook that says that you are subject to arbitration, if there is any dispute, that these young people will not be subject to arbitration, that they can actually go try their case in open court. And I was actually shocked, surprised to see that most of my colleagues did not support the amendment to even help the youngest employees among us when something as horrific as an assault occurs. The other two bills, Senate Bill 19 and 31, I think I've talked about those before, but again, these are regular Missourians who are having their rights taken away, their rights to collectively bargain through a union, because we're really shutting down the unions by passing some of these pieces of legislation. And regular Missourians who work in a workplace that may not be what we hope all of our workplaces will be, and that really don't have their day in court, to not only expose what's happened to them in an open way, but to expose what may be a culture of negative acting in the place of employment where they work. Those are some of the things we've been dealing with on the floor. The governor released his budget, as we talked about, I think, last week, and some of the testimony that we've heard around that actually has come through other committees besides just the budget committee. So this week in seniors, families, and children, the area agencies on aging, which help provide in-home care to people who need it, so some of our seniors and some of our disabled people who provide Meals on Wheels, who are often the lifeline to members of our community who are living in their own homes or apartments, who, if they did not have these meals or access to home care to help them with some things, may end up in a nursing home, which, as we know, is very expensive to the state. So in the governor's budget, we see a 3% cut to social services on top of the $200,000 withhold we've had from this social services budget. So those things together are really concerning to the area agencies on aging, who are thinking that there will be hundreds and hundreds of people throughout the state of Missouri who will no longer be able to either get their Meals on Wheels or get their home attendant care that that they need. And if that happens, we know what happens. And I actually have some numbers here from the area agencies on aging that were provided to me about the cost nationwide of nursing homes versus the cost that we pay to provide in-home services for people. So the National Association of States United for Aging and Disabilities has estimated that these in-home care services, these community-based services, are about $18,000 to $20,000 average per person around the nation. So in Missouri, they're a little bit lower than that. But that Medicaid, the cost to Medicaid for a nursing home is about $53,500 per year. These are both annual costs. In Missouri, we think it's more around $47,000. So we're talking about maybe $16,000 per person to provide some pretty significant in-home care to allow some of our seniors and people with disabilities to access services they need to keep them aging in their homes versus about $47,000 per year to have them go to a nursing home. So 2 to 3 times the cost, and that would be picked up by the state through Medicaid. So we're not being really wise in how we're looking at what we should do in the budget. And one of my concerns always is that especially with new people at so many levels of government, not only at the gubernatorial level and most of our statewide offices, and many people who have never served in the public sphere before, but also with so many new legislators all the time because of our turnover due to term limits, that there are people who may not understand the long-term ramifications of what our budget decisions do to the state of Missouri to help those people who are most vulnerable, who we will end up helping one way or another, whether it's through emergent care by having them go to emergency rooms or whether it's through sending them to nursing homes where the expense is really great. I'm hopeful as the budget goes through the House and Senate process, we will be able to make some changes to those areas. But also interestingly pointed out to me yesterday was that at the executive level, there has been a 4% increase in the executive branch's request for funding. In addition to that, on top of that 4% increase, we know the governor has created a new position, the COO of the government. So, we're looking at adding costs and, in my view, creating more bureaucracy at the top level when some people who really need the state's help, children, those with disabilities, seniors, people with very low incomes who need our help and help them to age in a way that is not so expensive but provides them with a decent life when the money isn't going there. So I have all kinds of concerns about those. I'm just going to briefly touch on the fact that I have 3 pieces of legislation that look like they may be moving forward. One is the prescription drug monitoring program. I think I may have talked about that last week. I've heard from Senator Schatz, who rolled my bill into his. That may be moving forward, so I'm delighted about that. I also have had the senator who heard my bill on unlicensed in-home daycare centers come back to me with one problem he had in one specific area. We're working to make a change there, and then we think he will have that be voted out of his committee. And then the bill on flu vaccinations so that the people who work in daycare centers and hospitals are around our patients and our most vulnerable people, make sure that they have flu shots so that they aren't infecting people who are vulnerable in a health way. So excited about going forward, grateful for my senators and colleagues on the other side of the aisle who are looking out for some of my bills and trying to help me make them a little better so that they can move through the process. So that's it for this week.